On a night in 2013, a woman in her 30s named Erin heard loud banging on her front door. She opened it up and saw her best friend Robin standing there, and she could tell right away that Robin was terrified. She was shaking, tears were running down her face, and she had scratches all over her arms. Erin led Robin inside to the couch and asked her what was going on. Robin told her that she had just been over at her ex-husband's house to drop off their 2 daughters and everything seemed to be fine, but then her ex-husband's new wife came into the room and had just started yelling at her. And before Robin could even say anything, this woman ran across the room and attacked her. Robin said her ex-husband had managed to pull them apart, at which point she had grabbed the kids and left. As Erin sat there listening to this wild story, she actually was not surprised, because she knew the woman Robin had been fighting with. And when Robin was finished talking, Erin told her to never be alone with that woman again, because Erin said that woman was the kind of crazy that will kill you. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button orders delivery, wait until their food is sitting on their porch and then run up and steal it. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of April 7th, 2014, 32-year-old Robin Spielbauer tucked her 10-year-old daughter into bed in their house in Amarillo, Texas. Robin told her daughter that she loved her, said goodnight, and then walked out of the room. Robin could hear the TV on in the front room of the house, and she began heading that way, but before she got there, she stopped to look in on her younger daughter. Robin peeked into her bedroom and saw the little girl was already fast asleep. And as soon as she saw this, Robin just felt this complete sense of calm come over her. As a single mother with 2 young kids, Robin's days could get busy and chaotic. But she was finally able to relax each night when she knew her daughters were safe and sound in their beds like they were right now. Robin left the bedroom and walked down the hall into the front room of the house, where she found her mom and dad watching TV. Robin took a seat on the couch with her parents, grabbed her phone out of her jeans pocket, and quickly sent a text message. Robin's mom looked over and asked her daughter if everything was okay. She was fine, just making some plans. Robin knew her parents loved having her and the 2 girls in the house, and they played a huge part in helping her take care of the kids. But Robin thought in a perfect world, she would not be living with her parents in her early 30s. Because for many years before she wound up back at her parents' house, Robin had been living a life she loved on her own. When she was 22, she had fallen in love with a great guy named J.D. Spielbauer. J.D. was a former United States Marine and had served in Afghanistan and Iraq. Robin's father had been in the military most of his life, and so her parents had been really happy when Robin started dating a military veteran. Robin got pregnant just 2 months after they started dating, and so she and J.D. had their first daughter, then got married, and then they had their second daughter a few years later. And for Robin, ever since she was young, all she had wanted was to be a mom. And so she didn't really care that she and JD struggled with money sometimes, or that raising kids really wasn't always easy. She and her husband loved each other, and they had these 2 beautiful girls. That was more than enough to be grateful for. But in 2012, after she and JD had been together for almost 10 years, everything began to change. JD became distant, and he started spending a lot of time away from home. And not long after that, Robin had discovered that JD was cheating on her with a woman named Katie Phipps, who just happened to be one of Robin's friends from church. After Robin had learned that her husband and friend were having this affair, she divorced JD, took the kids, and moved back in with her parents. And not long after that, JD had married Katie Phipps, which really only added to the tension. Back on the couch, Robin's phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down at the text, smiled, and got up. She told her parents she would have to run out for a bit and asked if they could watch the kids while she was gone. Her mom said of course, and then asked if Robin was going out to meet her new boyfriend. Robin blushed a little, but didn't respond. Then she just grabbed her purse, told her parents she wouldn't be gone too long, and walked out the front door. A few minutes later, at about 9:30 p.m., Robin drove her black Chevy Tahoe out of town and turned onto Helium Road, which was a long, winding dirt road surrounded by farmland on both sides. As she drove, Robin cranked up the country music on the radio and looked out at the huge Texas night sky. The only light on the road came from her headlights and the moon, and this made Robin feel like she was out in the middle of nowhere. But that was perfect as far as she was concerned. In fact, that's why she'd chosen Helium Road for this meeting in the first place. She didn't want anyone to see what she was about to do. Eventually, Robin pulled her SUV over to the side of the road, put it in park, and began to wait. And as she did, she listened to the radio and looked out the window. And then eventually, she saw headlights coming down the road behind her. The following day, at noon, almost 15 hours after Robin had left her house, a middle-aged man drove his truck down Helium Road. The sun was bright, and it was about 65 degrees Fahrenheit. It looked and felt like a perfect spring day. As the man was driving, he spotted something in the distance, so he slowed down and squinted. And he was surprised by what he saw. 3 young girls were running down the road right towards him, and they were screaming. This part of Helium Road was usually pretty deserted, and it wasn't really a place where kids played. So the man immediately hit his brakes, put his truck in park, and stepped outside to see what was going on. He walked over to the girls and asked if they were okay. And without breaking their stride, all 3 girls pointed behind them and started yelling, "She's dead! She's dead!" The man looked where the girls were pointing, and he saw there was a black SUV parked on the side of the road. He told the girls to stay where they were, and then he ran over to the SUV. And when he got there, at first glance, it just looked like somebody had abandoned the vehicle. However, when he walked to the passenger side of the SUV and looked at the ground, he just froze. The man was in total shock at what he saw, and it horrified him that 3 young kids were clearly the first ones to have stumbled onto this scene. The man took a breath and steadied himself, then he grabbed his phone and dialed 911. A little later that afternoon, Sergeant Alan Mongold of the Randall County Sheriff's Department sped down Helium Road. Up ahead, he saw there was an ambulance, cop cars, and a fire truck, and then behind him, driving as well, were more police cars. Sergeant Mongold could not think of a time ever when this spot on Helium Road, basically in the middle of all this farmland, had been so crowded. He eventually pulled over and parked his car not far from a black SUV and got out. And immediately, an officer ran over to meet him and said he'd taken statements from the 3 young girls and the man who had been there when he arrived, but he'd arranged for the girls to be taken home, and he'd sent that man on his way. Mongold said that was fine. He would follow up with them if he needed to. And then he and the other officer walked around to the passenger side of this black SUV, and they joined a group of paramedics who were already standing there. But as soon as Mongold looked at the ground just outside the car, it was clear the paramedics could not do anything. Because lying there on the ground was a woman's body. And based on all the bugs crawling on her, Mongold knew she must have been dead for at least several hours. Mongold put on his gloves and crouched down next to the body. The woman was on her back, and immediately Mongold saw a deep dark bruise on the left side of her head. And at first glance, this bruise did not appear to be something she got just from falling down or something. It looked like something had been smashed into the side of her head, like a heavy object. And so at this point, Mongold felt confident he was very likely dealing with a murder. He reached into the woman's pockets, but found they were empty. So he told one of the officers on hand to run the plates of the SUV. And then he and the others started to do a sweep of the area. Within minutes, Mongold saw the officer who had just run the plates waving him over. Mongold joined him, and the officer said that the SUV was registered to a woman whose name was Robin Spielbauer, and the image of Robin Spielbauer that popped up matched the victim. Pretty soon, members of the county's forensics team arrived, and Sergeant Mongold searched the area around Robin's body and her SUV again. And this time, a forensic tech saw something that seemed really strange. The back windshield of Robin's SUV had a small crack in it, and embedded in the crack were tiny pieces of hot pink plastic. Now, neither the forensics tech nor Sergeant Mongold had any idea what this pink plastic was from. But the tech said hopefully that would become clear after they ran some tests. The investigative team spent hours searching up and down Helium Road, hoping to find a potential murder weapon or maybe Robin's cell phone. But other than those pink plastic flecks on the SUV windshield, there really wasn't much to go on. Mongold considered the possibility that this could have been a robbery gone wrong, that someone had gotten Robin to stop her car, attacked her, and had stolen her purse and her phone. But the idea that a carjacker would choose this road to try to rob someone where there wasn't a whole lot of traffic just didn't make a lot of sense to him. And so Mongold couldn't help but think that maybe Robin's killer was someone she knew. The following morning, April 9th, Sergeant Mongold sat at his desk reviewing the autopsy report. The report stated that Robin had most likely died the night before her body was found, and then her body had just laid outdoors on the side of the road overnight. And even more importantly, the autopsy report confirmed that Robin had been murdered. Because in addition to the blunt force trauma wound that Mongold had found on the side of her head, the medical examiner had also discovered a gunshot wound from a .22 caliber pistol in the back of Robin's head. So, that morning, Sergeant Mongold went to meet with Robin's friends and family to learn as much as he could about her, and also to see if anyone close to Robin owned a .22. Mongold had informed Robin's parents about the death of their daughter the previous night, and even without the results of the autopsy report, he had told them he believed there had been foul play. And so through their complete shock and grief, Robin's parents had given Mongold a list of the few people who had been closest to Robin. And now, Mongold decided to start with her new boyfriend, a bartender named Jared. But the conversation with Jared proved to be pretty uneventful. Jared said he'd been working at the bar the night that Robin had died. He said she hadn't called him or texted him or anything. And Mongold was able to quickly track down multiple people at the bar who corroborated Jared's alibi. Now, the detective had no intention of crossing Jared off his list this early on, but Jared did not jump out as an obvious suspect. And so Mongold figured if Robin's current boyfriend didn't look like a major suspect, well, the next logical step was to talk to her ex-husband, J.D. Spielbauer. Later that day, now over 24 hours after Robin's body had been found, Sergeant Mongold knocked on the front door of J.D.'s house. And as he knocked, Mongold felt a bit surprised by where he was standing, because J.D. lived only a few houses away from Robin's parents' house. The door opened, and a woman who looked like she was in her late 20s with long brown hair and bright blue eyes was standing there. Mongold introduced himself, and the woman said her name was Katie, and that she was J.D.'s wife. She said news had traveled fast, so she already knew about the murder, and she assumed that's why Mongold was here, to talk about it. Mongold nodded, but before he could say much more, a tall, thin man with a cropped military-style haircut stepped outside. He introduced himself as J.D. Spielbauer. But immediately, his wife, Katie, snapped at him and told him to shut up, because she was talking to the police. J.D. immediately hung his head and fell silent. Sergeant Mongold acted like he didn't notice any of that, but in reality, he was taken aback. Married couples, even ones that didn't necessarily get along, rarely lashed out at each other in front of him, especially when they knew they could be potential suspects in a murder case. But Mongold remained calm and polite and asked them where they'd been the night that Robin died. Katie said that she and her son had been at a friend's house, and they had come home around 10 p.m. J.D. said he'd been home all night with his uncle, who also lived in the house. They'd just been drinking beer and playing some pool. Other than Katie's quick outburst at J.D., nothing the couple did after that seemed particularly strange. However, for some reason, Mongold just felt like there was a good chance both of these people were lying to his face. He talked to them for a bit longer, and then as they wrapped up, he told them he would be in touch if he needed any more information. But as he walked back to his car, Mongold already knew he'd be calling JD and Katie down to the station soon. He just needed to be better prepared if he was really going to interview them. After leaving JD and Katie's house, Mongold drove a few minutes across town to Robin's best friend Erin's house. Robin's parents had told Mongold that Robin and Erin were extremely close and shared basically everything with each other. So Mongold thought she'd be a great person to talk to learn more about Robin, but also he figured if anybody had inside information on Robin's ex-husband and his new wife, it might be Erin. And as it would turn out, Erin knew a whole lot about Robin's ex and his new wife. She told him that at one point, she, Robin, JD, and Katie had all been friends. But then JD and Katie had an affair and things got ugly. She said Robin constantly worried about the kids and wondered if she and JD should really be trying to co-parent them. Erin also said that JD talked a lot about suffering from PTSD because of his time in combat as a Marine. Mongold took notes on everything Erin was telling him. An affair, a divorce, and a potential custody battle could all be motives for murder. And while Mongold did not believe that all military vets suffering from PTSD were inherently violent, JD's condition was still something he had to consider. But Erin would tell Mongold something else that would instantly make him rethink his entire approach to JD and Katie. Erin said late last year, Robin had gone over to JD and Katie's house to drop off the kids. However, when Katie had come in and seen her husband and Robin talking, she screamed, grabbed Robin, slammed her into the fireplace, and threatened to ruin her life. That evening, Sergeant Mongold led JD into an interview room at the sheriff's station, and then he sat down next to him at a small round table that was pushed up against the wall. JD was wearing a t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap that he kept messing with like he was nervous. Mongold had spent most of the previous night trying to learn as much as possible about Robin, JD, and Katie's relationship, and he had worked with the phone company to secure a copy of text messages sent to and from Robin's cell phone. Mongold started the interview by asking JD to give him an overview of what he'd been doing on the night Robin died. JD spoke in a slow Texas drawl. He was polite and addressed Mongold as Sir, and he said basically the same thing he'd told Mongold when they met at the house. He'd been hanging out with his uncle at home, drinking and shooting pool. Mongold nodded and asked if he'd seen Robin at all on that day. But JD shook his head and said he had not seen or talked to her. Sergeant Mongold reached down and grabbed a file folder out of a briefcase. He opened the folder and pulled out a piece of paper. Then he turned to JD and said he wanted to help him because clearly JD was having trouble remembering things clearly. Mongold told JD that this piece of paper was a record of all the text messages Robin had sent and received on the night she died. And her final text exchange was with JD, just before 9:30 p.m. And it was clear from this text that the two of them had been planning to meet up that night. JD immediately took off his hat and ran his hand through his hair. He apologized for lying, and then as he tried to explain himself, he started to stammer. Finally, he got out that Robin was supposed to meet him that night at his house to talk about a standardized test their older daughter was supposed to take. However, JD said Robin never showed up. At this point, Mongold really began to press JD. He asked him if Robin had never showed up, why hadn't he reached out to her? And JD really struggled to come up with an answer. He remained polite and kept calling Mongold Sir, but as he was doing that, Mongold got the impression that this was not a man who planned things out, or who could easily organize his thoughts. And so eventually, Mongold told JD that he could assume only one of two things. JD had lied because he was the one who murdered Robin, or he had lied to cover for someone else. JD just shook his head and said he would never hurt Robin. But Mongold snapped back and said, well, if you didn't kill her, who did? JD went quiet for a second, and then he looked up at Mongold and just said, I have suspicions. Now, during this interview, JD did not come out and actually say who he suspected, but Mongold thought it was pretty clear. In fact, Mongold had the same suspicion since he talked to Robin's friend Erin. So Mongold didn't waste any time. He let JD go, and then had JD's wife, Katie, brought to the station and into the same small interview room. Katie was wearing a sweatshirt with a pink camouflage pattern on it, and while her husband, JD, had looked very nervous when he came in, Katie, on the other hand, just looked mad. But before Sergeant Mongold could even ask her a question, she said she needed him, Mongold, to tell her something. She said she needed to know if JD was having an affair with his ex-wife, Robin. Mongold said he didn't know if that was the case, but he did know that JD and Robin had planned to see each other on the night that Robin died. After hearing this, Katie broke down sobbing and put her face in her hands. She said she knew it. She knew Robin had been trying to tear her marriage apart because Robin had never gotten over JD after the divorce. But despite all the obvious anger Katie felt towards Robin, she insisted that she had nothing to do with Robin's murder. However, despite what Katie and JD said during their interviews, Sergeant Mongold still decided to secure search warrants for their house and their cell phones, and he felt sure he would soon be able to arrest one or both of them. On April 10th, so just 3 days after Robin's murder, Sergeant Mongold and the investigative team searched JD and Katie's house, and they quickly found a room filled with guns. Mongold didn't think that was strange, though. Amarillo, Texas was home to a lot of avid hunters, and most of the weapons in this room were hunting rifles. But one gun immediately caught the detective's eye. Sitting in an open case was a Sig Sauer .22 caliber pistol. Now, Robin had been shot with a .22. But that was not actually the only thing that made this gun stand out. This gun had hot pink plastic accents on part of the grip and the barrel. And when Mongold leaned down to get a better look, he noticed that part of the pink plastic on the grip was cracked, and that small pieces of the plastic appeared to be missing. And so right away, Mongold assumed that those small pieces of pink plastic that were missing must have wound up embedded in the back windshield of Robin's SUV. Investigators quickly found out that the gun was registered to Katie, and they even found photos she had posted on social media of her holding that gun. And later that day, when police searched Katie's text messages, they found something just as damning. In the 4 days leading up to the murder, Katie had sent 336 text messages to JD, threatening to ruin him and Robin. And the final text message, number 336, which Katie had sent to JD about an hour before Robin had left her parents' house and driven out to Helium Road, said, "You started this whether you want to believe it or not. I will finish it." The Randall County Sheriff's Department and the District Attorney's Office moved fast. On April 11th, 4 days after Robin's murder, they arrested Katie. However, before the case could go to trial, the DA wanted either a confession or clear evidence that demonstrated Katie had been driving on Helium Road on the night of the murder. Katie refused to confess. She just repeated her story that she had been with her son at a friend's house and then gone home at around 10 p.m. that night. Now, Katie's cell phone had pinged off a tower near the murder site at the time Robin was most likely killed, but that tower also would have pinged if she was driving from her friend's house to her house, so it was not the definitive evidence the DA was looking for. The search for some elusive piece of evidence that would ensure a guilty verdict began to frustrate the police. After all, Sergeant Mongold and his team had Katie's gun and her threatening text messages to JD, and they knew Katie had once slammed Robin into a fireplace. But Mongold and his team's hands were tied, because the DA's office had taken over the investigation. The DA's office wound up re-interviewing people connected to the case and also scouring surveillance footage from locations just outside of town to see if they could spot Katie's car pulling onto Helium Road. But none of this led to anything new, and the investigation dragged on for months. And so the DA began to worry that he would never find this piece of evidence that would definitively win over a jury. But on a day in July of 2015, over 15 months after Robin's murder, a woman who worked for the DA rushed into his office, and she had a very excited look on her face. She told the DA that she'd seen a story on the news about how certain cell phones left a clear digital footprint when they were connected to Wi-Fi. Essentially, police could use this Wi-Fi data to track exactly where a phone had been, which was far more information than a cell phone tower could provide. When the DA heard this, his face lit up. He'd never heard about this type of search. So he gathered his team, and they immediately got in contact with the phone and internet companies, and soon they were able to trace Katie's exact path on the night of the murder. This was exactly the kind of evidence the DA had been looking for. And not long after that, the DA got another big break when he was contacted by Robin Spielbauer's mom. She told him that she had just gotten this very bizarre phone call that she knew would help his investigation. And the information Robin's mom provided, along with the newly collected Wi-Fi data, finally solidified the case. Based on the information from Robin's mom, cell phone and Wi-Fi data, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what authorities believed happened to Robin Spielbauer on April 7, 2014. That night, the killer drove their truck through town, trailing just far enough behind Robin so as not to be spotted. The city lights slowly disappeared behind them as the killer followed Robin out onto a dark dirt road. And after a few more minutes of driving, the killer saw Robin pull over and park. And so the killer slowed down as well and parked right behind her. Once they were stopped, the killer put on a pair of gloves, grabbed a gun from the passenger seat, and then stepped outside, leaving their headlights on. The killer calmly walked towards the SUV, raised their gun, and slammed it against Robin's back windshield. The windshield cracked, and the killer heard Robin begin to scream from inside the vehicle. The driver's side door of the SUV suddenly flew open, and Robin lunged out of the car and started screaming at the killer. But the killer just raised their gun. Robin saw the gun in the headlights from the truck, and she ran towards the farmland that surrounded the road, trying to get away, but the killer followed, and they aimed at Robin in the low light, and they fired. The bullet struck Robin in the back of the head. She stumbled, her body twisted, and she fell to the ground on her back. The killer approached and saw Robin was still breathing, so they aimed the gun at her forehead and pulled the trigger again. But the gun jammed. The killer panicked. They rushed back to their truck, glancing over their shoulder to make sure Robin was not getting up and running off. The killer found a tire iron from the truck bed, took it, and ran back to the side of the road where Robin was still laying on the ground. The killer held up the tire iron and swung it hard into the side of Robin's head. Blood spilled from Robin's temple out onto the ground. Now she stopped breathing, and she died right there on the side of the road. The killer leaned down and took Robin's cell phone out of her pocket. They searched her other pocket for personal items, but she didn't have anything else on her. So the killer walked over to her SUV, leaned inside through the open driver's side door, and grabbed Robin's purse. And then with that in hand, they shut the door behind them. The killer ran back to their truck, hopped in the driver's seat, and sped off down the dirt road back towards their house in town. Once back inside the safety of their home, the killer walked right into their gun room, and they would put the gun they had just used to shoot Robin, a Sig Sauer .22 caliber pistol with a pink plastic grip, into an open gun case. At this point, the killer took a deep breath and began to calm down. They were convinced the police would eventually find this pink gun. And when they did, they would believe Katie had murdered Robin. Katie Phipps would stay in prison for over a year awaiting trial, while the DA's office tried to find evidence that would ensure her conviction in court. But Katie didn't murder Robin. Her husband, JD, did. It would turn out that Katie's suspicions about JD and Robin had been correct. JD, who had cheated on Robin with Katie, had now begun cheating on Katie with Robin. But JD knew Katie had caught on, and the whole thing had now turned into a total mess. He wanted both women out of his life, so he murdered his ex-wife and framed his current wife for the crime. On the night of the murder, the way JD had lured Robin to Helium Road was he had been texting back and forth with her to set up a meeting on that secluded road. That way they could carry on their affair without being seen. Police had considered JD a suspect, but the bulk of the evidence they found seemed to point to his wife Katie. She had sent hundreds of threatening text messages, had physically assaulted Robin, and had claimed she was going to, quote, finish what JD had inadvertently started. And when tests were run on Katie's gun, the pink plastic from the weapon matched the pink plastic police had found embedded in Robin's back windshield. And so, after only a 4-day investigation, police had arrested and jailed Katie. But over a year later, as investigators and the DA tried to shore up their case before going to court, new evidence came to light. Katie's phone had not been connected to Wi-Fi on the night of her murder. However, her son's phone had. And so using the Wi-Fi data from her son's phone in connection with cell phone tower from Katie's phone, police were able to see that on the night of the murder, Katie's route was directly from her friend's house back to her own house. At that point, they realized Katie had been telling the truth. She did not kill Robin. Also, investigators came to believe that many of Katie's threatening text messages to JD might have been about divorcing him and exposing his affair, not about harming Robin. So with this new evidence, police released Katie from jail, and the DA admitted he had rushed to judgment about her guilt. Once Katie was out, investigators quickly turned their attention to JD. And one of the first things they discovered was that JD's stories about suffering from PTSD were a complete lie, because JD had never served in the military. It was just something he lied about to impress women. And so the fact he had successfully carried out this lie for years and had even convinced police it was true helped lead the investigators to believe that JD was much craftier than they had given him credit for. They came to assume that everything he'd told them during the investigation was potentially a lie, and that he had the personality and the mental capacity to frame someone else for murder. And then finally, when investigators really began to move in on JD, Robin's mom contacted the DA about this bizarre phone call she got. She said that JD had called her and asked her to lend him a significant amount of money so that he could take his daughters on a trip to New York ASAP. With everything else investigators had learned, they saw this as a huge red flag. They believed the reason JD was trying to go to New York was actually just to make a run for the Canadian border. So they arrested JD before he could leave town, and they charged him with the murder of his ex-wife Robin. JD was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He'll have a chance for parole in 2046. Despite the conviction, some members of the sheriff's department continued to believe that Katie had played a role in this crime. But once she was released from jail, Katie was never arrested or charged again in connection with Robin's murder. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the Mr. Ballen Podcast, and also Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.